Is that? Yep, that's a bass. Stuck at pipe. Oh, what's up, guys?
Really?
What is with you and fishing games?
Look, the black bass was the best that Nintendo could do for fishing games in the 80s, and two, I'm a redneck.
Have we been here before? I feel like we've been here before.
This is kind of familiar. I don't think you wear that t-shirt. You know. Look, I have to get this one, and it's a big one. Not sure it's the granddaddy one, but it's definitely one of the bigger ones in the flight. What's up with the pipe, though? They're like all red, orange fire. The Japanese know what that is. Oh, come on, no, there's a green piece of algae with 2 yellow dots. There's no way. You know that's not a fish. Just not, lost it. That is a lemur move, dude. Just trolling lemur.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unqualified Experts. I'm your host, Braden Gardner.
And I'm Rob Seidel, also known as Sorless in the gaming community.
We're very fortunate to have Sorless here with us today. We kicked it old school last episode talking about the best SNES games on the console, and turns out when you're an expert on one series of retro games, you're usually an expert on several of them. So Sorless has been gracious enough to come back and offer us his expert take on the top 5 NES games as we kick it even older school today. So I'll have a link to his Twitch channel in the description below, as well as on the screen. Make sure you go give him a follow. If you like retro games or Overwatch or Teamfight Tactics, Rob's your guy. You're absolutely going to have a good time watching his streams. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And I'll go ahead and have you start with your number 5 pick for one of the top games on the NES.
Okay. So my number 5 pick comes as Rampage. And although this game had a soundtrack that is painfully redundant, who doesn't really love running around punching helicopters and breaking down buildings and just blowing crap up? It's a lot of fun in that regard, beyond the fact that you only get to pick from a couple different characters, but still, you get to go around, beat up buildings, eat people, and punch helicopters. So that's why I like this one.
Rampage is a pretty simplistic game, but it's also a really big step up from entries like Donkey Kong, which I feel it is most easily compared to on the NES. You pick one of 2 monsters, you climb buildings, punch out windows, eat people, attack helicopters. Like, you get a lot more of the King Kong style experience out of it than you do jumping over barrels and climbing a conveniently structured construction site to get to the big bad at the top. And honestly, it's one of those that I found myself playing quite a bit longer than I expected, in all honesty. But just going around beating up buildings is good enough, and it really just was the next step up from that style of game. And I have to say, I hadn't played it before getting the stock footage for the video, and I had a ton of fun with it. Like, it's a good way to kill an hour or two.
You can definitely tell by the music or lack thereof and the graphics that it was earlier in the life of the Nintendo, but it was nice to see something like this on a home system instead of just like in an arcade.
Completely agree. Solid pick. So for my number 5, I played a lot of really challenging NES games as a kid. And one of the ones that I just could not stop playing, regardless of how many times this game killed me, is Super C. Now, I have a confession to make. I never played the original Contra. I still haven't. I own the original Contra now and still haven't had a chance to pop it in the Nintendo. So you'll probably see that on one of my streams at some point. But Super C really takes the concept of a bullet hell and brings it to the NES in a brutally challenging but still somewhat fair format. You can have 1 or 2 players playing, and you have a wide variety of different guns that you can use throughout the course of the game, most of which are introduced to you pretty quickly in the first level. And you've got access to your regular pea shooter, you can get machine guns, spread guns, flamethrowers, you can even get a laser in the later levels. And I'm not sure what it is that keeps me coming back to this brutally punishing bullet hell, whether it's just the array of cool weapons, the wide selection of side-scroller and open exploration maps, whether it's the rush you get from finally defeating that super difficult boss at the end of a map that's been killing you and your buddy over and over for the last 2 hours. Maybe it's all of them, but Super C really just has me coming back for more despite its difficulty rather than being discouraged by it.
And see, I'm in the opposite boat. I've played the first Contra, I've not played Super C, so I don't have much experience with it. I did love the first one a lot. It's got a great soundtrack as well. And the only way I could ever get through it was with the Konami code to get those extra 30 lives. Does it have it in Super C also?
I don't know, but I imagine it would. It's got 2 number slots for the number of lives you've got left, so I have to assume the Konami code works there as well. And honestly, I'm disappointed I didn't think to plug that in, because I always forget it's a Konami game.
Mm-hmm.
No, that makes sense. I'll have to give that a go the next time I try that and see if that helps me at all. Odds are it'll just help me send 27 more characters to their doom.
Okay, my number 4 pick is River City Ransom.
Oh, this was so good.
Yes. So this is a game where you're fighting a local gang of students to free your city and to free one of the 2 characters' girlfriends. And it's kind of like a beat-em-up RPG. So when you kill enemies, you get coins, which you can collect to purchase various foods that can modify your stats permanently, or books that teach you new skills on, like, instead of just doing a single punch, you do like a rapid punch, and same with kicks and a better jump. Those tend to be a bit more expensive, but it's got these RPG elements to it where you can expand your stats and your abilities, and it's just a good time beating people up. There's various weapons that you can find, different objects in the environment, like a tire or a trash can and stuff like that, or a box, like a wooden crate that you can throw at people or just smack them in the head with. You can also use other people to hit people with, which is pretty fun. And this is a game that was always fun to play with my brother growing up, until one of us would accidentally hit the other, because it does have friendly fire, and as siblings you can't really forgive that. You have to get your revenge, so it would end up in somebody dying in one form or another, whether it was being bludgeoned to death or thrown off of a cliff, and then it kind of killed the whole co-op experience. So maybe it wasn't the best co-op game for siblings to be playing.
But by the same token, I appreciate that the co-op has friendly fire, because this is a true beat-em-up. Like, this is one of those where you have 1 or 2 people wandering around fighting anything and everything that gets in the way. And I really liked getting to try out some of the different weapons. Like, there's a variety of them. You can get different variations of brass knuckles, you can get tires, you can get crates. The crates were my favorite because they give you an insane amount of reach to club people. But you can also punch, kick, you can do jumps with your punches and kicks to get some better angles in on your enemies. And you can throw literally anything you pick up, including the brass knuckles. So I started off my first few minutes playing this game picking up and just throwing nightsticks, because that's the first item you get. And I didn't realize you could actually use them for melee. I was just like, oh, I got a thing. It's used for throwing. I throw it at my enemies and pick it up and throw it at them again. And then one of them picked up a nightstick and started beating me up with it. And I was like, wait a minute, how do I do that? I want in on the extra reach that's going to give me. And this is one of those that, again, I hadn't played it before getting the stock footage, and I could see myself picking this game up and adding it to the permanent collection. It's just that good. This is an amazing pick.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, and you can make it into a grindy game if you want it to be able to afford all the things. You can go back into areas and beat people up again, and it's just a good beat 'em up.
Solid pick, and thank you for introducing me to that one, because that's going to be a ton of fun at some point in the future.
Definitely.
So, for my number 4, I'm going to keep on the trend of insanely difficult games that are still fun to play. And I will start off by saying that the first Castlevania was an excellent game for how early it came out in the NES's lifespan. And I'm also one of the people who will say that the risks taken with Simon's Quest were generally worth it, despite its many flaws. But the true pinnacle of that franchise on the NES has to go to Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. Like, this game was phenomenal, and is one that I will still break out and play to this day. You have all the same familiar side-scrolling whip and special weapon action that you expect from the first Castlevania. But then the level design is better, the enemies are more varied. You get access to forks in the road, which allow you to kind of control how you get to Dracula's castle. And along the way, you can actually pick up companions. You can make a deal with up to one person at a time, and they'll come with you and be a secondary character that you can toggle between. You can get access to Grant, who can climb walls, but has a slightly reduced variety of special weapons. And his defense is kind of meh, but he's got some of the best jumps. You can play as Sypha, who has all the best special items because her magic is top-notch. If you've watched Netflix's Castlevania series, you'd be hard-pressed to disagree. They did a good job representing what she can do in the NES to life across the 4 seasons of that series. However, her staff has no reach, her defense is absolute garbage, and just be careful when you're freezing things that you don't accidentally put yourself in a position where you're going to stop your momentum. And then the lightning, which is typically found in the same candles as the boomerangs, so it's kind of difficult deciding which you want to pick up, but it can seek out enemies on the screen with up to 3 orbs, and they do a decent amount of damage. Super good. Obviously, Sypha's my favorite. And then you have Alucard, who has a spread shot for his basic attack with fireballs, and he can turn into a bat, which is super useful for getting through some of the later stages of the game. But you can only use the pocket watch as a special weapon, and the pocket watch kinda sucks. There are points where it's really useful, but on the whole, meh. This game is hard, though, and go ahead.
It's definitely challenging. That was my favorite thing about it, though, is that you get to choose those different companions. It gave it a new... I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. It gave it new life for me in the Castlevania style games, because I'm not the greatest at these types of platformers, but I do enjoy them. So to be able to turn into a bat or climb on walls to help get around certain obstacles was very useful, and yeah, I would definitely put this game on a top list as well.
That said, if you do make it to the end of the game, the primary flaw with this is how they handle your road to Dracula. If you get to the last series of stages, you're expected to get through a full normal stage, and then climb the stairs, make sure you have enough hearts, and gear up your double trouble and triple threat for special weapons. And then you have to go through a full 3-phase Dracula fight. And if you're playing as Trevor or as Alucard, who can take the most hits, you can only get hit 4 times before you die. That 4th hit will kill you. And you have to go through all of this in one go. A full 3-phase fight, a full stage, just all of this nonsense. You don't get to start at the bottom of the stairs like in the first Castlevania. It's just not a reasonable thing to ask, and it's punishing even by NES standards. If you have managed to complete this monstrous challenge, congrats. It's real hard. I've done it once, and that was many years ago, and I don't think I could do it again, as evidenced by the fact that I abused the ever-loving hell out of the Castlevania Collection's save state system, so I wouldn't have to go back and redo phases of the boss fight again. And if you've already got that notch in your belt or just don't feel the inclination, save yourself the swears and the headaches. Go for the Castlevania Collection on this one so that you have the save states.
Yeah, the collection's really solid. And could you imagine being able to have games like this back then and having save states?
Oh my goodness, that there would be so many fewer broken controllers in the world.
Exactly. My number 3 is from the Mega Man franchise. It is Mega Man 2.
Classic.
I think that this one resonated with me the most because I found Mega Man interesting, but it was very challenging. And this one had more bosses, and everything just made more sense to me because if you want to kill a Woodman, well, get the saw blade or get some fire, and those are the things he's weaker to. So it just made more sense. And of course, it's a Capcom game. They all have that sound where even if you didn't know that they made it, you'd know by the music that it's a Capcom game. And it's quality music and a pretty solid game. I think it was a lot better polished than the first Mega Man.
I completely agree. I think that Mega Man 2 really cemented the formula that all classic Mega Man games, and even the Mega Man X games to an extent, followed for their entire lifespan, where you have 8 bosses, you have a weakness order that you're supposed to go through, the platforming is on point, it's not too difficult, but it's not too easy either, and it's just a ton of fun to play from start to finish. However, I would be remiss in not mentioning the most busted part of this game, and that's the Metal Blade. I gotta tell ya, I played through this game, and right before the video, I've played through all of them to one degree or another. This was my favorite franchise growing up. The Metal Blade is just busted. 4 of the bosses are weak to it, including Metal Man himself, where one hit just takes him out. It blows my mind that that weapon was allowed to run through the game. You're either going to be just tearing through everything, or if you come up against the small handful of things that are just immune to the Metal Blade, like the little jumper mechs, then whatever, I guess you can get out the Buster for those occasions, or the quick boomerangs. Something else, I guess. Otherwise, once you get the Metal Blade, go to town. It's the easiest game ever at that point. So, my number 3 is actually my only real RPG entry on this list. You might be able to argue one of my later picks technically fits in that genre, but it's a game that actually doesn't get as much press as I would expect it to, but it has a lot of elements that past and future Zelda games really took advantage of, and that's StarTropics. So, for some quick context on StarTropics, you're basically playing as a baseball pitcher, and you're off to go rescue your uncle, who is a scientist. And you start off by traveling to an island village, and you start asking some questions and getting some information about how you go to get to his lab. And then you transition from an RPG open world element to more of an action-adventure pseudo 3D environment with some very clever puzzle elements and lots of switches that are hidden to either open doors or find secret weapons to make your trip through this dungeon easier until you get to a boss fight at the end. And this game is broken up into many different chapters that automatically save at the beginning of each one, so you can easily pick this up for an hour or two at your leisure, put it down, and then come back to it. It's not one of those where you feel you have to keep going forever and ever. You can actually get a lot of really good stop points to pace yourself, which I really like.
Now, I don't have any experience with StarTropics, but I have noticed that the menu looks a lot like Zelda's menu, which is the first thing that struck me about it. And that if you don't have the letter from your uncle that comes with the instruction manual, you could be pretty well hosed on trying to complete the game.
Yeah, and the letter was a cool bit because it encouraged some out-of-game elements to even decipher the clue, because you needed a code in order to be able to progress, which I believe is 747, but you could only get that if you submerged a portion of the letter in water. So, if you happen to have an unsubmerged copy, don't submerge it, because I'm sure that's a collector's item nowadays.
Definitely.
But it's cool that they gave you something to further your immersion, because that was something that wasn't always easy to do in the era before 3D. You couldn't necessarily visualize the environment you were working in real life or playing in, trying to get from point A to point B. But this gave you kind of that Indiana Jones feel that required you to do something out of the game, which has been varying degrees of annoying in re-releases, but on the whole was a really cool touch that you just don't see in games anymore.
Do you know if the second iteration, Zoda's Revenge, had much similar playstyle or anything, or did they change it up completely?
No, Zoda's Revenge actually played very similarly to the first one. Same sort of layout, same sort of puzzles. I don't think they were quite as fresh as the first one, like it was almost a little too samey, but it was still a solid game. I would recommend either one in a heartbeat.
Yeah, I'll have to try them out.
Highly recommend it.
Okay, down to our last two picks. This was a tough one for me, because there's a lot of great ones, and I feel that, kind of similar to your SNES, that the first and second one could go either way. They're both really great games, and so number 2 for me is Dragon Warrior 4.
Ooh.
It was the last iteration of Dragon Warrior on the NES, and the thing that made it very interesting to me is I missed out playing Dragon Warrior 2 and 3, so I don't know what I missed, but coming from Dragon Warrior 1 and coming to this, it was like night and day, and it was significantly better RPG. Don't get me wrong, I love the first Dragon Warrior a lot, but this one just did so many things very well. It's like an episodic adventure where each chapter you're going through and learning the story of each character and getting attached to them and seeing what makes them them, and that was very well done. Like I said, in Final Fantasy VI, I'm not necessarily a big fan of where you split into those groups, but I feel like the way that they handled this was great, and then you meet up in the end to conquer evil, and that was just a really cool game.
Yeah, and kind of, now that I've had a bunch of other retro games under my belt since playing this for the first time, because growing up I played through all of the Dragon Warrior games. 4 is the best one, although there's nice things to say about 3. And they've had various re-releases under the actual name of the series, which is Dragon Quest. 4 is very reminiscent of Final Fantasy II. Not 2 released in America, but actual 2 in terms of the meetup. Because you have a party of characters that are going to have their own stories. In this one, they're the primary focus of their chapters, whereas in Final Fantasy II, they travel with the main party and then die, and then meet up in the underworld. So, kind of the same sort of thing here, but Dragon Warrior 4 does a really good job centering the story on each individual person. And I gotta say, a common theme across all the Dragon Warrior games on the NES, they're hard. I went to the first town over, which just required a simple jaunt across the countryside, a walk through a cave. There's an NPC there who's like, oh, hey, I'm on my way to this town too. And I freaking died on my way to this town. And I even waited till I was level 2 before attempting the journey. Like, that just was like, man. Hard had a whole new meaning on the NES, and Dragon Warrior really exemplifies that, but the RPG gameplay is top-notch. Highly recommend.
I especially like the difference between 1 and 4, where in 1 you were a single character, but in 4 you've got an entire party, and that party evolves as you go along. And I think my favorite chapter was actually chapter 4, where you're playing as the merchant, and you go outside, you gather up some stuff, you try to sell it, and just rinse and repeat until you're sick of doing that. And it was just kind of fun. And as a kid, it also taught me how to gamble in a casino, so that was fun.
Look, these are important life skills that our
Yes.
parents weren't going to teach
Right.
us.
You gotta teach kids early.
It's important. Well, fair enough. Solid pick. My number 2 pick by comparison is going to be super cliched, as is my number 1. Sorry in advance, but if we're talking about the literal best and most influential games on the console, I couldn't put a list together without talking about these games. So let's go ahead and get the first one over with. The Legend of Zelda, complete in its resplendent gold cartridge. For how early this came out on the NES, this game did so much that other games at the time just didn't. This was a true open world experience from the get-go. Like, you start off in the middle of this, for lack of a better term, room on a grid that isn't terribly well mapped out except for latitude and longitude in the upper left-hand corner. And there's a cave. Fortunately, it's pretty obvious you should go to the cave, so you can make sure you at least have a sword to defend yourself as you go wander the countryside. But if you choose not to grab it, that's totally cool too. You can just go do your own thing and hope for the best. And you can explore pretty much anywhere in this game, minus a few niche areas that you need to get into dungeons with some items. But your goal is to go through 8 dungeons, put the Triforce back together, and then go to a final 9th dungeon to confront Ganon. And in Ganon's dungeon, he's guarding the silver arrows like a good villain. And if you happen to stumble into where he is before finding the silver arrows, well, enjoy your game over. You'll be doing this again. But the gameplay is just solid. There are secrets galore. My criticism with the secrets, though, is that it is not at all clear where they are in the game. Like, you just have to know where they are. You have to know which bushes to burn with the candle. You have to know where to put your bombs in the rocks to find the secret caves. And if you don't, you're going to miss out on a lot of money, a lot of heart upgrades. But they're not required to beat the game, which is nice. And you also have access to a whole second quest after you beat the first game, or you can put in a specific name in your name registration screen to just skip straight to the second quest. So it also kind of pioneered the concept of randomizers because everything is changed around in the second quest. You don't know where anything is. It's almost never in the same spot. So while there are a few things that it was a little too cryptic on, there's a lot it did right, and it really pioneered a lot of game design for a lot of franchises moving forward.
Yeah, this is definitely a wonderful game. And like you said, with not having any clear indication of where any secrets are, it requires a lot of trial and error, or having a guide to tell you where to look for things. But the fact that there's just so many secrets made it a really fun game to kind of share those secrets with your friends when you're grown up, so you could see what you found that they haven't, and vice versa.
Which was really cool, because we didn't have Google back then.
Yeah.
It was literally Nintendo Power if you were lucky. If you wheedled your parents enough, you could call a help hotline. Or you compared tips on the playground. That was how you got this done. So how many hours did you spend leaving and coming back to screens burning every bush with the blue candle?
I can't even imagine.
It was a lot of hours. My primary thing that I did was I farmed a lot of money to buy keys because there was a shopkeeper who sold dungeon keys, and idiot me didn't realize there's an infinite key later in the game.
Yes.
So all that time was just worthless at the end. So I'm wandering around dungeons. I'm like, I got like 30 keys here, man, and then that XA shows up on the screen. It's just like 60 rupees times 30 keys, and oh dear God, what have I done? Great game.
My first save up was always for the blue ring, because I always got hit by stuff. So
Once you find where that is, yes.
yes,
Good luck finding it, though. They're real cryptic about that, and
yeah,
you have to either find the right person to tell you where it is, or hope that you pay enough money to the gossip that's like, pay me something and I'll tell you something useful.
yeah, and even then, some of those clues like were not clear or well translated. One of the two, or both.
Yeah, and having references to geographic locations in that game that you could only get if you happen to have a map or the book or the instruction book. Not the best way to handle that, but given the time, I'd be hard pressed to find a better way to deal with it.
Yeah.
The things we learn along the way.
So my final game is another RPG, and this one, I would say, is my favorite because it is what launched me into my love for RPGs, which is Final Fantasy. So, Final Fantasy, like, it was awesome because it let me customize my team to be whatever grouping of classes I wanted, and I could name them whatever 4 characters I wanted. So typically it was after friends and shortened versions of their names so that I could feel like we were going through an adventure through this mysterious land. But that being that, it was a very hard and unforgiving game. Like, you can only cast so many spells from like your level 1 magic and so many spells from level 2. And then if you try to cast the life or life 2 spell in combat, it tells you that's too dangerous, but it still uses your spell. And they give the final boss instant death spells and cure 4 to go all the way back up to full, and he's resistant to pretty much all forms of attack, so it's a real grind to be able to beat. I've only beaten it like once. With the re-releases, they have done quality of life adjustments to make it a lot more user-friendly and not so frustrating. But I just loved that you could mess around and do decent or have decent replay value by, like, I would try doing like 4 black mages and see how far I could get. And spoiler, it wasn't very far, but it was still a lot of fun.
Yeah, this was the RPG that literally put the genre on the map. Final Fantasy is still a popular franchise to this day. It's had over a dozen sequels. It's very customizable. Like, it was also kind of the most faithful interpretation of D&D to a virtual game too, in a lot of ways, particularly with the magic system. You had characters who had the ability to equip certain weapons and certain armors, and characters who just couldn't use that stuff. And there were a lot of strengths and weaknesses to consider for each one. The Game Boy Advance re-release I played a fair bit of as well, and it's considerably easier just because they have a better understanding of how to put together a UI. So it sands off a lot of the rougher edges on that axis, and it's just an easier version of the game in a lot of respects. The NES version is merciless. And I gotta say, I've tried the 4 black mages, I've tried the 4 white mages. It's hard as all get out. You're gonna spend a lot of time and money reviving dead mages for a while. That's just the way it's gonna be. But by the time you reach endgame and can just start hurling top-tier magic at your enemies, it makes it all worthwhile. Puts a smile on my face. So what's your go-to party?
It would always be 1 fighter, a thief, a white mage, and a black mage. Because you have that thief to help you get away in a run, the fighter for that tankiness, and than your healer and your caster. Sometimes I would try to mix in a red mage, but he's a jack of all trades and a master of none, so he just wasn't as great as he could have been.
Yeah, as I say, I think growing up, I ended up going fighter, thief, and 2 red mages, just because it made early game much easier to have 2 red mages. But the catch with that is you only have access to 3 slots to learn spells at each level.
Yep.
So you have to be extra careful about what you teach them. And it's already hard enough if you go white and black mage, because there are 4 spells at each level in white magic and black magic for the most
So you
part.
always have to pick and choose one that you're not going to get.
Mm-hmm. Nowadays, I am more partial to fighter, black belt, white mage, black mage.
Yeah, the black belt was a lot more powerful. I think I was turned off to him because of the lack of gear that you would ever have to buy him.
He's really good early. It's like getting a fast start, but then you pay for it later because he just doesn't get more weapons.
Mm-hmm.
So great to kind of stand side by side with your fighter in the early parts of the game, but definitely lags behind the fighter or even the thief later on. It's a tough call as to whether it's worth it a lot of the time.
Yeah, another thing that made it tough too is if you had all 4 of your members attack one monster and it died,
Oh, yeah.
it invalidated the rest of their actions. That were
Ask
still
me how I
targeting.
found that out.
Yeah, that's fun. An ineffective attack.
Yeah, it's just like, what do you mean we missed? And it's like, wait a minute, we're all attacking that empty space where a monster used to. Oh no.
That was a good improvement in future.
I'm glad that did not last.
Yeah,
Ugh.
and rough.
Alrighty, well, there's a clear elephant in the room we haven't talked about yet, so I would argue that this is probably the single best game released for the console. Much as I love Final Fantasy, much as I love Zelda, you can't argue with all of the things this game did right. This is one of the few that you could easily call a near perfect game. So, let's talk a little bit about Mario 3. The first Super Mario Brothers was iconic at the time. Like, came out super early in the Nintendo's lifespan. Wasn't it a launch title?
Yep.
So it was a launch title. Super responsive controls, the ability to run, the concept of secrets, good platforming and level design that gradually ramped up the difficulty. Truly a masterpiece. Then we got Super Mario Bros. 2, which was the we can't handle a harder version of this game, and I guess we'll see actual Mario 2 in the Lost Levels on the Super Nintendo later, where we got instead what I have to assume was a fever dream in video game form in Mario 2. Not a bad game. I had a lot of fun playing it, but it's very different and pretty trippy. And then Mario 3, which really went back to the roots and improved on them in nearly every conceivable way. Co-op gameplay, where you switch back and forth, is still there, but you now have access to an overworld map with branching paths. So you didn't have to necessarily take the same exact path to get where you were going a lot of the time. You could divide and conquer with your second player. You had access to minigames that would give you access to items you could store and use right away when going into a level, so you didn't have to start off as Little Mario. You had a slew of cool power-ups that you could get, from the Raccoon Leaf, which let you fly or attack enemies on either side, to the Tanuki Suit, which gave you invulnerability, or the Sledgehammers, which were my personal favorite and really hard to find. Arcing sledgehammer throws, just... it's hard to find a power-up that makes you feel better. Such a good game. A lot of people have already taken their time to sing its praises, so I'm not going to spend too much more time on this myself, but it's truly a masterpiece and probably the pinnacle of gaming on that system, in my opinion.
Definitely. I think my favorite suit was the frog suit. Because
Same.
having to go at a very slow pace through the water and not be maneuverable as well really hurt. So having that frog suit really helped me get through those stages. But it's such a great game, and it was featured in The Wizard, and like it got so much hype, and it lived up to it.
I liked watching Mario just hop around instead of walking. Like that was just
Yes.
that was what I loved about it. It wasn't super useful on the land maps, but I have to agree, it was my favorite. Good choice, good choice.
Yeah.
So that covers our top 5 picks for NES games. Now we want to hear from you. Tell us what we missed. Because we covered a lot of really great games here, but the NES has an expansive library and was kind of the last console to really be the Wild West of gaming. So there are a lot of gems out there. And I also want to take a moment again to thank Sorlus for lending us his actual expertise on the subject. He knows a lot more about these games than I do, and I've gotten to play a whole bunch of new awesome games that I never would have looked at as a result. So thank you again for agreeing to come on.
Thanks for having me.
No problem.
I'm glad you found some new games, and I've got some to try out too.
Absolutely. And don't forget to check out his Twitch channel in the description below. And until next time, great gaming!
If you like what you just saw, please support us by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more great gaming content.